Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's class, which is a discussion of Aristotle's De Anima. And we'll be talking about the soul, including the souls of very little cute things like this cat. That's Widget, my cat, Widget. And we'll also be talking about the souls of plants and Aristotle's thoughts on psychology and psychological abilities that we have, including perception and thought. Maybe a little bit on imagination and on desire, but we'll probably go over that stuff a little bit more quickly. So there are definitely some weird, controversial things going on in this book in the sense of they cause a lot of scholarly controversy. It's unclear exactly how we should interpret Aristotle and what he's doing and whose theory he is or isn't agreeing with. So we'll talk about that. So stay tuned. So this here is an illustration from a medieval manuscript copy of Aristotle's De Anima. It's kind of cool. It's a little scary looking for a modern reader, but it shows this scribe sort of attempting to understand Aristotle's theory, which is what we're going to be trying to do today. This text basically is Aristotle's treatise on the nature of the soul and its functions. And one important thing to note is that Aristotle understands the soul primarily as the thing that animates living things. It's the animating property of living things. And it would be helpful to carry in from last time our knowledge of Aristotle's metaphysics and how he talks about the soul as the form of that corresponds to kind of a living being, right? So living beings are made of body, and this matter is in a particular form, and together the composite thing is the living organism. Aristotle thinks the soul is the form part. We'll see whether that holds for the entirety of this book, but one important other thing to note, we'll get into this later, is that Aristotle thinks that although all souls are fundamentally similar in that they all have some basic abilities in common, they are different in that there's sort of a hierarchy of abilities and therefore a hierarchy of types of soul that you might have. So book one of Aristotle's De Anima, of which we have 3 books, is sort of talks about Aristotle's theory of method of inquiry, right? So one thing we didn't have time to discuss in this class is Aristotle's theory of how to proceed scientifically and how to make scientific inquiry work. And what he says in those texts, specifically the topics and the posterior analytics, is that Aristotle likes to start by talking about accessible things that we can sense, things that we can more or less agree about, and go from there and try to come up with first principles. That is the specific, basic beginning assumptions that will then help us explain everything else that we see. And Aristotle's theory on method here has been very influential, and he applies it basically in this book of De Anima. So he starts off talking about like what soul is and what the study of the soul is about. It's about better and more wondrous things, so it's a particularly great thing to study. And knowledge of the soul, he says, helps us learn about nature because the soul is the starting point of living beings. Sorry, my cat just tried to knock over my my computer here. I've got to maybe control that. Hold on. Okay, sorry about that. So Aristotle says we want to know about the nature of the soul and its substance, and then on all of the coincidence belonging to it. So the idea is we start with what the soul is, and then we'll try to find out all of the other things that have to do with the soul, including its different capacities and the capacities that correspond to different types of living beings, right? So, you know, things like plants and animals in particular. So he says, the study of what it is, which is what we're doing here. We're doing a study of the metaphysics of the soul. Is it possible to study it with a general form of inquiry? Do we need special methods? Right, because if you go with Plato's theory of the soul, you definitely need special methods to study the soul, because the soul isn't something that's perceivable. But Aristotle is committed, as we'll see, at least in the beginning in book 1, to the idea that the soul is an embodied thing, and therefore we can study it just like we would study any other natural phenomenon. So we're not in a very difficult position in inquiry. But he lists, because he's Aristotle, a lot of very specific ways in which he will proceed with the inquiry and specific questions he wants answered. I leave these for you for later if you want to explore them in more detail, but we start with kind of the general features of souls, and then we move into questions about the differentia, like the different species of soul and the different functions of soul. So we start with the more general thing, and then we get to the more specific thing later. So here's Aristotle's exposition of his main understanding of the soul. The soul and affections of the soul can be given by, quote, enmattered accounts. And this is why we as scientists, or what, for a long time we're called natural philosophers, this is why we can study it. So Aristotle's scientist cares not only about the matter, but also about the form and function of the matter. So it's important to note that he's not a materialist in kind of a way we might talk about it in the modern day, necessarily. He understands soul as form and function in matter. But nonetheless, it's the kind of thing that's perceivable, it's sensible, it's part of the regular, ordinary, perceptible world, and so it can be studied. And I have here a little cartoon of Plato and Aristotle from the School of Athens painting. And Plato is pointing up because he thinks, obviously, that the forms and the soul and all these objects are abstract and invisible. They're kind of, up in the heavens. And Aristotle is sort of gesturing forward and down, right, toward the world. It's supposed to be kind of a metaphor for how they differ. But there is an asterisk here, which is that he will say slightly different things in books 2 and 3 about the status of certain parts of the soul. So it's not clear how much he is committed to the idea that soul is always enmattered. Maybe there's a distinction between the soul of like natural and mortal beings and the soul of like divine beings. There are some open questions. We'll get to that. But he does think, sort of to start off by making our inquiry easier, right? You look around the world and there's all kinds of living things, right? There's trees, there's birds, there's butterflies, there's like all kinds of things that move, that are nutrified, there are plants. You might be worried that if you're studying the soul, namely the thing that animates all of these living creatures, you might find like a million different souls. But Aristotle is committed to saying that no, they all share something. All of these living beings are different from non-living beings in 2 crucial ways, in movement and in perception. He says the soul is a mover. It is something that makes things move. And we will qualify this and understand it in a different way in a minute, but the idea, right, is very straightforward. Birds, they're animate, they have souls. Butterflies are not, are animated and they have souls. A big rock, for example, a lump of dirt just doesn't have a soul, right? And that's the big distinction. And so Aristotle says, well, look, we have a thing that's in common across all of the types of organisms that we could study. So we are not in trouble if we try to come up with a general account. So he says, by way of qualification, right, the soul is not kind of an object like the way that Plato conceives of it, that is separable from the body. He even says, you sort of have to be careful with the language. It is better not to say that the soul is feeling pity or learning or thinking, but rather that the human being is doing so by means of his soul. right? So the idea is the human is thinking by means of his soul, but it's not that the soul is thinking, right? The thing that thinks is the whole creature, which is matter plus form, right? So that creature is thinking by means of the soul. And one other important asterisk, right, is it seems like Aristotle wanted to say that soul implies movement. We might ask, are thinking or things like being in pain kinds of movements? Sort of. So the idea is like the capacities are sort of kinds of movement, sometimes just a sort of internal movement. But he does say, even here in 1.4, something that will be echoed later, the understanding is presumably something divine and is unaffectable. So the idea is most of our movements and stuff can be explained by body, but there's this other part of the soul, which we'll discuss in more detail, that might not be explainable in terms of body. So we already get ourselves into trouble. Now we conclude book 1 and we get into book 2, and Aristotle will talk about all of the different creatures and their different capacities. And one important idea that comes out again is Aristotle's hylomorphism, which we saw already in his metaphysics. It's the idea that things are, the substances are made of both matter and form. So the matter is the potentiality of an object, right? The lump of clay could become a statue. So in a sense, the matter is potentially that substance. And form is the actuality or the actualizing of that potentiality into a substance or an object, right? So souls, then the question is, what are they? Well, they are the form in this case, whereas the bodies are the potentialities. So the idea is like the living organism will be a hylomorphic compound of a particular matter that is actualized by a particular form, or in this case, form understood as function, by a particular set of functions that are performed by that set of matter. So Aristotle says some natural bodies have life, meaning self-nourishment, growth, and decay. But then living things are not merely bodies, because bodies are just matter, whereas living things are substances over and above bodies. What he's saying is living things are more than mere bodies, because bodies are mere matter, and living things then have to be the compound. So hylomorphism, again, is the doctrine that physical objects are compound substances made of both matter and form. Living things are in this way hylomorphic physical objects. Here's another analogy, if you're tired of the clay analogy. This is one that's popular with Aristotle scholars. An eye, even for Aristotle, will have two components, right? They're sort of metaphysically, there's the eye jelly, there's the goop that makes up your eye, right? And then there's the ability to see. For Aristotle, something isn't an eye if it doesn't have the ability to see. It's just sort of potentially an eye. Right? It's only actually an eye if it does have the capacity to see. Similarly is the relationship between body and soul. The body is potentially an animal, but it's not an animal if the animal's dead, right? It's just a corpse. So in order for it to be an animal, an alive thing, it must have the soul, that is the ability to function as a living being, right? Hopefully the analogy is starting to make sense. So souls are a substance, but in the form way, Aristotle says, the actuality of a natural body that has life potentially. So souls are a substance in the sense of being the form that corresponds to a potentiality in a body that actualizes the living creature. Right, we can postulate here another analogy, which is an analogy using a heart. So you might have this organ, the heart. It could just be like a hunk of muscle and blood, right? If it's not in a human body and it can't move. But if you give it an energy source and put it in the right place, it can perform its function of pumping blood. And if you've got both the matter and that function of pumping blood, then you have a heart, right? So just as organs are defined by their function, um, the soul and the total animal are defined by their function. So I am only alive if I am functioning as a living being. Even the parts of plants, it turns out, have functions. Aristotle tells us that the roots of a plant are the analog of a mouth because both take in nourishment. I really like this part of Aristotle's theory because it's something that biologists still use as a reference. The idea of classifying kind of types of biological functions by what they're used to do as opposed to what the specific structure is kind of a foundational principle in biology. And we can count that all the way back, at least to Aristotle, if not further back. Right, so roots are like a mouth, right? Even though the plant is upside down. And Aristotle does talk about this. He talks about how direction is different for different creatures, right? Up and down don't mean the same thing to different organisms because they might have different uses of different things that are up and down. He says, what is common to every soul is the first actuality of a natural instrumental body. The soul is the first actuality of a natural instrumental body. What does that mean? The soul is just the starting principle. It's the thing that, and he goes on and defines this, that causally explains the movement of the body, the action of living, right? And he explains in the text that he means causality in three ways. One is according to a formal cause, so literally the soul is the form of the body, that is an animal, right? The form that corresponds to the animal. The soul is also the efficient cause, as in it's literally the cause of movement. And finally, the soul is the final cause, which we talked about last time, means it's the goal toward which, or the purpose toward which things are oriented, right? So the soul being life, right, primarily about living, is sort of the goal. It's the goal of maintaining life and the goal of reproducing life. So sometimes, right, reproduction is the end toward which organisms aim, right? They want to make more of themselves, right? They release seeds or they have sexual intercourse as a means of producing more of themselves. All right, so in books chapters 2 and 3, we get more fine-grained metaphysical questions. And I'm just going to give here a general summary, but he basically says that we can give a definition of soul. We can give an account of soul in the same way that we can give a definition of things like a triangle or a circle. And he says, what has a soul is distinguished from what lacks a soul by life, right? So what's the difference between things that have a soul and don't have a soul? Well, the things that have a soul are alive. That's it. And a thing is alive if it has any of the following things. If it has understanding, perception, movement, and rest with respect to place. The movement involved in nourishment, so trying to get food, right? Like plants move to try to get sunlight. The roots expand to try to get nutrients from the soil. And also withering and growth. So living also involves kind of getting bigger or smaller, right? So if anything has one or more of these properties, then it will have a soul, right? And then one thing that indicates is that these different sort of capacities are correspondable, we'll see, to different parts of the soul. And we might ask, are these different parts of the soul separable or not, right? Can you separate perception from movement? Can you separate nourishment from understanding, right? And that's one of the issues that we'll be dealing with for the rest of book 2. And I'm just going to note two puzzles. One that Aristotle notes himself, which is a question about bugs, right? So some worms, right, if you cut them in half, they keep moving, and sometimes they can grow their other half back separately. And you might be like, does that indicate that you can sort of have infinite parts in a soul or something? Aristotle sort of seems to wave it away and say, it's confusing, but really at the end of the day, we can give our same account. And a question that I, as a reader of Aristotle, have is a question about the understanding, because as Aristotle says, it seems to be a different genos, so a kind of soul, and it alone admits of being separated, as what is eternal does from what is capable of passing away. So he seems again to be suggesting that there's this part of the soul that isn't mortal, right? His other enmattered account of the soul and his other like function-based account of the soul makes it sound like if you die, you have no soul, right? You're dead. So there's a sense in which the soul can't persist, right, after you die, because how could it? It requires that the body be manifesting a particular function, and if the body doesn't work anymore, then you wouldn't persist. But here in this passage, he suggests that the understanding is maybe a different kind of soul, and it can be separated from the other kinds of soul, and that it is eternal. Which sort of suggests that maybe he thinks there's an immaterial part of the soul, which sets out all kinds of questions. And it messes with me as much as it messes with you, I promise. All right. So here's again the illustration of the hierarchy of the parts of the soul. Now that we've talked about them a little bit more, as we'll see, plants have what we might call a vegetative soul. Plants have the capacities of growth and reproduction. Animals have what we can call also a sensitive part of the soul, and they have the vegetative parts too. So animals, of necessity, if they have mobility and sensation, they must also have reproduction and growth. And finally, we have human beings who have a rational part of the soul, which involves thought and reflection. And if they have these, they must have the other two. This seems to be Aristotle's theory. Cool question for the reader. What would Aristotle say about computers? Right, so computers sometimes are characterized as having intelligent thought. They have the rational part of the soul, but in many cases they don't have mobility or sensation, and they don't have reproduction and growth, right? Computers can't, well, most of them can't make more of themselves, and most of them can't like grow bigger or smaller. Most of them don't need like nutrients. I mean, they need a power source, but right, so the question is this a way that Aristotle would say computers aren't alive? Not really, because sort of they don't have the necessary prerequisites in this hierarchy. Or is it the case that he'd say computers do have souls because they have one of the requisite parts of the soul, and that's all that you need, even if they have it in a really weird and unnatural way? I'll leave that to you. The next thing Aristotle talks about, because he wants to talk about each of these capacities in more detail, and I've sort of split apart the order here now. I'm just talking about things kind of subject by subject. One of the things he talks about is plants. So here I have my little alfalfa sprouts that have been growing. They might have grown too much, actually. They may not taste good now that they've got a lot more leaves, but I kind of enjoy having nice green things in my house. So plants, they're alive. How do we know they're alive? Well, they grow and they decay, right? The plants get taller, and they can sometimes die out. They get ugly and a little messy. So I don't know if you can see this, this right here. This is part of a fern that fell off that my cats chewed off of the fern. And that's probably going to wither and die, right? So that's the other thing. But they don't have perception or thought. Plants can grow. They can, like change shape. They get nutrition from the soil and all this stuff, but they don't move around. At least not unless you put them on a time lapse and speed it up. And then you might see like the little leaves kind of shooting out, and those beautiful time-lapse videos of flowers opening up and so on and so forth. That might give you an idea that maybe plants move, but they don't move in like the sense that animals, right, can move around. I can sort of wave my arm voluntarily. I can stand up and sit down. I can separate myself from the place where I'm currently located. Plants can't do that, right? And Aristotle's aware of this, so he thinks this is a distinction between the vegetative part of the soul and other parts of the soul. So the nutritive part of the soul is the first and most common capacity of soul, says Aristotle, in virtue of which life belongs to everyone. The idea here is one that's still popular in biology. Living things are things that look for nutrition, right? They want to generate maybe more mass, maybe more of their own kind, right? So these little seedlings, I grew from seeds that were produced by other members of the species. And all living things, Aristotle says, because they want to share in the divine. So his theory is like all living things aspire to divinity, and that's why they reproduce or they replicate themselves. This is a little bit of Platonic theory in Aristotle, right? Plato says in the Symposium that because humans seem to be mortal, right? We don't have eternity. We can't stay in the heavens forever. We eventually have to drop back down to earth and so on and so forth. We want to resemble the divine as much as possible, and that's why we reproduce. And Plato says that that's why we should try to reproduce beauty, because that'll make us even more close to the divine. Right? Aristotle likes this point, but he says it about regular organisms. He thinks that regular types of reproduction is just as divine. And the purpose of nourishment is both to preserve the body that's ensouled and to equip it to be active, right? So if you don't have a soul, then you wilt, you die, and you can't do your job anymore. If you as a plant don't have your plant soul, good luck getting any nutrition, because you need it. You need the soul to do that. So the soul limits and promotes growth as necessary. And Aristotle here has kind of a jab at some of the pre-Socratic philosophers who thought that fire is the thing that soul is made out of, and explains all the movements of the soul, and the fire always moves up. And Aristotle's like, well, I agree that fire always moves up, but because the different creatures are oriented in different directions, right? Plants might sometimes need to spread their roots downward. The soul is the thing that promotes the growth in the direction that is needed, as opposed to just going according to the natural tendency of fire. So that's one of the reasons you need soul, because you need it to sort of limit the activity and make it useful. And now we can talk about animals. So animals also grow and decay like plants. Animals also seek nutrition. And they do also eventually seek to reproduce in many cases. But animals have a special ability that plants don't have, which is the ability to perceive. And Aristotle is very perspicacious, and even he notes that animals are animals even if they don't move or change their place, because all that you need in order to be an animal on Aristotle's theory is to have perception. So, for example, think of sea sponges. Sea sponges are animals because they do. Actually, I might be wrong about that. I was thinking of a different example. Sea sponges, I don't know if they perceive things. I wonder if sea sponges would count as an animal according to Aristotle. No, I was trying to think of an example of an animal that perceives but doesn't move. And I do think that there must be one of those. I think maybe sea anemones are a better example, because they move maybe only passively, but they do clearly have sensation. Like, they've got this like poison they can inject into animals that get too close, except for clownfish. Maybe you can think of another animal, something that doesn't move around, but that does perceive things. I don't know, maybe like a scary creature with just like one eyeball or something. So those things would count as animals for Aristotle, even if they don't move, because the perceptive part of the soul is sort of the essential bit to get to the level where you have the animal part of the soul. And Aristotle says the primary form of perception for animals is touch. So like this is the most basic perception organ for Aristotle. It's like knowing when I'm contacting something else. And for Aristotle, as well as for many modern psychologists, I think most people think this, taste is also a kind of touch. So putting something in my mouth, like I just did with the alfalfa, that's a way of tasting. It's just a kind of touch. It's a kind of chemical reception. And Aristotle was way ahead of his time with that one. And he also says one thing that comes along with perception is desire. So because I can see things now, I can want things now. So he sort of seems to suggest that maybe plants don't desire things. They're maybe more automatic than that. They don't have like wishes or dreams or, pursuits. They just sort of act according to their plant programming maybe. But animals, anything with perception does have desire, maybe because it sort of now has the capacity to detect and thus want what it detects, right? I like that theory. And Aristotle spends quite some time in book 2 talking about perception. Perception for Aristotle is a form of alteration. And this is one thing we're going to maybe have to talk about in more detail in our Zoom session and our discussion section together, because it is a little confusing. Aristotle says that perception is only potentially active. It doesn't activate on its own. And what does that mean? Well, I can't sort of like in a dark room force myself to perceive. It's not how it works. It's not up to me whether I'm perceiving something. I'm sort of passive with respect to the objects of perception. And Aristotle says in this passage, it seems that perception is of particulars. That is, what I'm perceiving are particular objects, particular like this somethings. So this is a something. I'm seeing it right now. It's like right in front of my face. But knowledge, he thinks, is more about universals. So what I perceive is this particular set of alfalfa seedlings. But if I know things about alfalfa, what I know isn't just about sort of these seedlings in particular or something. It's about alfalfa as a category. So my knowledge would be about universals. My beliefs about alfalfa would be beliefs about universals. We're not going to get into that kind of the epistemological stuff too deeply here, because I think it's a big rabbit hole. But I'm sure you've already come up with some questions of your own, so I'd love to hear them. Aristotle says perception occurs by the perceptive part of the soul being affected by the objects of perception. And this is the key point here. So for Aristotle, the perceptive part of the soul changes to accommodate the objects of perception. So in order to be able to see this plant, something about my perceptual system changes in response to the plant. And it has to change in some way that's analogous to how the plant is. And I mean, this is an abstract enough thing to say that we can make sense of it in modern language. Like, for example, we know that in order for me to perceive this plant, right, some bit of light has to hit it and then bump into the back of my retina, where I have, all of my sensory neurons for vision, and they connect to my visual cortex and they give me information. So the idea is my retina is changing in response to seeing this alfalfa, right? And so in a sense, I am changing to accommodate the percepts, in this case, the soul. is changing to accommodate its percepts. And Aristotle does have a theory sort of like this. It's more intuitive with things like smell, right? As in the illustration here on your screen, this little girl is smelling a rose, and we do think of smell as something that happens by having tiny bits of the rose, tiny particles that the rose emits, wafting up into our noses, right? And making contact with our noses and sort of imprinting on our noses. But that's how Aristotle thinks of how perception works altogether. It's sort of all maybe tiny effluents of objects or something, making contact with our bodies and altering our forms, right, or our souls, in order for us to perceive. It's a very like empiricist way of understanding perception as a bunch of like impressions, literally like impressions pressing in, right? Aristotle says there's still an open question about how animals that can't perceive certain things may or may not be affected by the mediums of perception other animals can perceive. So, so some animals can't detect like heat or something, right? And you might wonder whether they're affected by the things that are floating in the air that are the heat, or something on Aristotle's theory, or whether they're affected by the little smell particles, or whether they're affected by the light particles if they can't see light. So this is cool that Aristotle's already wondering about this. So that's the account of perception. Lots of questions to ask about it, but I'm going to leave them for a discussion. Book 3 now, that we've finally gotten to book 3. Book 3 is the most challenging book of De Anima. Mostly because it's challenging for readers in that there's a lot of things to reconcile, and some scholars call book 3 the litmus test for Aristotle scholars, because basically this is where everybody has a particular kind of Aristotle that they want to encounter, and that's usually what they read book 3 in light of. They sort of turn Aristotle into the person they want Aristotle to be. And maybe some of these things will come out more clearly in a minute. So in book 3, Aristotle tackles things like imagination, which in Greek is fantasia, and understanding, which in Greek is nous. Your book translates nous as understanding. Some scholars translate it as thought or as mind. I don't know of a perfect way to translate this term, but Aristotle means it to be a particular capacity of the rational part of the soul. There's 2 interpretive puzzles that I will highlight, although there are many more than these. One interpretive puzzle is how to understand the relationship of nous, which is proper to human beings as rational animals, to the other parts of the soul. So how is nous related to perception? How does nous get the objects of its activity transmitted to it, as it were? And also related to this, is the understanding really eternal? As Aristotle seems to suggest in book 1 and book 2, but does he have an argument in defense of this? Is it just sort of an assertion? And another question, is it not embodied, right? So if the understanding is eternal, and it's separate from the other parts of the soul, which is what Aristotle seems to suggest, then it seems to contradict book 1. We get ourselves in trouble. And an additional puzzle, which is how the understanding accesses its objects. One of the popular interpretations is that understanding works analogously to perception. So the understanding sort of receives impressions of its objects. But remember, the objects of perception are supposed to be particulars, and they're concrete, right? Like, the objects in the world are like, I can touch them literally. But what the nous has as its objects are abstract universals, right? If knowledge is of universals, then the understanding thought is about those things. It's about the forms of objects in the world. And then how do I perceive them with my nous, right? It's not literally perception, but it's accessing. It's just curious. So how do we make sense then, if the account is analogous, of the soul changing its form to accommodate the objects it understands? How does the understanding change its form? How do we make sense of that? Before we get into that mess, I'll say a couple of words about Aristotle's theory of fantasia, or imagination. And this is a rather quick summary, so I apologize, there's more to say, but I've got to keep it low. Perception is not imagination, says Aristotle. Perception requires present objects. And by implication, right, imagination doesn't necessarily require present objects. You can be asleep and be dreaming, and you'll be dreaming of, like, I don't know, a different house you used to live in or something, and you don't need to be in that house in order to have that house as the object of your imagination. But perception requires that you be sort of in contact with the objects. And some animals, Aristotle says, have perception, but not imagination. So that sort of suggests that imagination is kind of a higher function, is a more complex function. Perception is a less complex function that all animals have. But perceptions, Aristotle says, are always true, and imagination is naturally not always about things that are true. I can imagine unicorns, I can imagine Santa Claus. Right? So far, nothing that controversial has been said. Imagination, says Aristotle, is not the same as those things that always grasp the truth like knowledge or understanding. So that's what indicates that it must be a different faculty, is the fact that that it's not as good at being right, which is unfair. Me as a scholar of imagination, I'm like, don't be so mean. Imagination, Aristotle says, is also not belief, which requires reason. Not all imagining creatures have reason, so it must be the case that it can't require reason. So imagination is sort of something that you can have as a capacity if you have perception, but you don't necessarily need to have reason. And if Aristotle is correct, imagination is, quote, a movement that comes about as a result of the activity of perception. That's a little bit of a surprise, because it makes it sound like imagination is something passive. Imagination isn't something that you, like, actively engage in doing. Whereas some accounts of imagination do very strongly characterize imagination as something active, something that you produce objects for, something that you can sort of mess around with in your head, right? But if it just sort of comes about as a result of the activity of perception, it makes it sound like kind of like some vapors rose up into your head and sort of gave you errors or something. It makes imagination sound passive, more like just the category of hallucination or of dreaming, right? Things that you don't usually actively control. And that makes sense, but it seems to leave out this more active capacity of imagination. So I have questions for Aristotle. All right. Moving on, now we're in the hardest part of the book, the understanding, or nous. So now that we've talked about each of the different parts of the soul, and we're like at the most central part of the rational soul, I will say that book 3, chapters 4 and chapters 5 are the most perplexing to Aristotle scholars. They're the places where all the controversy arises. Some things Aristotle says are very clear and straightforward. He says the understanding should not be mixed with the body, because it must be unaffectable, but it must be receptive of the form of intelligible objects. It needs to be unmixed with the things it understands, because it's necessary for mastery of the things it understands. So the thought here seems to be, and this is already doing some interpretation, so take it with a grain of salt. The thought here seems to be that my understanding, my thought, when I know things, what I'm doing is I'm able to separate myself from all of the particularities and all of the vagaries of things like my perception, things like the imperfections of the objects in front of me, right? Like, especially when you think about mathematical thought, for example, that's maybe more clarifying. When I draw a circle in front of myself, right, I am not like doing something that is about that particular circle, right? So that's a very patchy circle. It's not a very good circle, but I can do math using this model of the circle, right? I can give it an arbitrary R value, and I can say some things about circles as a whole, or same thing with a triangle, right? Even if I don't draw the triangle with like good straight lines, if I specify that this is a right angle, like there are certain things that I know about this triangle, right? And so on and so forth. So the understanding, if it were mixed with body, maybe is what Aristotle is thinking, it wouldn't be able to actually be about triangles, right? The idealized forms, triangles. It would only be able to be about this particular wonky one that I drew, which is what I'm perceiving. So what I must understand has to be something more abstract than this. So the suggestion is the nous then is separate from body. That is, at least conceptually, it must be able to separate body. But in this passage, it also seems like Aristotle takes it literally. He might be thinking that the understanding doesn't have an organ that corresponds to it, right? So seeing, I have eye organs, right? Smelling and tasting, I have organs for those. Hearing, I have organs for those. Movement, I have muscles for that, right? Those parts of my soul are explained by reference to parts of my body, but where is your mind? I mean, in the modern day, we'd say it's in your noggin, right? It's in your brain. Your brain is doing the thinking, and that's the organ. But in Aristotle's time, they weren't quite sure what that hunk of matter was doing in your skull. I think they thought it had something to do with regulating heat, regulating body heat. So that wasn't the place where the soul was. Maybe the soul was where your heart is. That was sometimes a way that they talked, right? Because when you say I'm thinking, you point here. But the heart, right, is an organ for pumping blood. It's not an organ for thought. So the conclusion here ends up being that no part of your body is necessary for thought. Maybe all of it together is necessary for thought, but you can separate it, right? Maybe this is where he's coming from. Another piece of evidence that Aristotle gives, so this is part of his argument, is that your understanding can't be affected by knowing too much of something. So if you know too much mathematics, you're not like, wow, suddenly blinded and like you can't do math anymore because, oh, you have so much knowledge. It's actually the opposite. Whereas if you go into a room that's like really busy, it has a million things going on, flashing lights, right? Music, and it's like strobing, you get overwhelmed and your senses can even be damaged, right? There is a way that too much light can blind you, too much noise can make you go deaf. But that doesn't happen with knowledge, says Aristotle. Knowing more isn't gonna like make it harder to learn more things. Presumably, hopefully that's true, because otherwise some very smart people are in trouble, right? So let me see if I can get back to, oh, there we go. So gotta clear all my drawings, there we go. The understanding. This is Shields's interpretation of Aristotle, and this is basically from his entry in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. He suggests that Aristotle is giving a hylomorphic analysis of thinking. That is to say that it's an analysis that's directly parallel to his analysis of perception. So the way that thinking works, what its objects are the intelligible forms. So just as the different perception organs are affected by the objects of perception, and they're supposed to change in response to the objects they perceive. So like if I see something green, my color receptors in my retina change in order to respond to that green and to be something like the greenness or something on Aristotle's theory. So does the mind, the nous, the understanding, change its form. It is informed by, informed here with an E, informed by the intelligible form of the object. And it becomes isomorphic with the object. So if I perceive like a star, and I think about stars as a shape and like the properties of stars and how many points they have and how many edges they have and so on, the idea is my understanding is changing its form in response. So my thoughts literally take on some of the shape of the star, but the abstract shape of the star, not the literal perceptible shape of the star, maybe. So a possible analogy we can use, hence this illustration here in the back, is that maybe the mind works like a wax tablet. If you were to write in a wax tablet, the wax would change its shape in response to like the letters that you were writing or the drawing that you were making, right? Some etching techniques use something like this. The medium literally changes to take on the representation. And that's maybe the way to understand Aristotle's understanding. That makes sense. Naturally, though, there are going to be some problems, right? Because this is a little bit confusing. How does that work? How do you access the intelligible form of something? How do you extract the intelligible form of something? Aristotle doesn't give us a lot to go on. And the other problem is that the bits where he's talking about these different elements are the bits that are the source of the most amount of scholarly controversy. So Aristotle starts talking about like kind of a passive nous and an active nous. That's caused all kinds of issues. And then there's the issue of whether the understanding is eternal and the issue of why the understanding is separate from the body. Does that mean that he's not a materialist, right? Does he think that there's a part of the soul that could survive death, right? What is his thoughts on immortality? All of these like really big questions, it turns out, get kind of muddled up together in these couple of passages. So I'll give you a highlight of some interpretations of these passages, and they take different bits from different parts, and not all of them are incompatible, but some commentators think that the difference between the passive nous and the active nous is the difference between memory storage and active thinking. So in chapter 5, Aristotle's talking about active thinking and the different functions of active thinking, whereas in chapter 4, he's just talking about something like memory storage. There's the active thinking that has these properties of eternity. It's like always active or something. It can't be off. I don't know, maybe he's talking about consciousness and how we always have to be conscious if we're alive or something, and in that sense it's eternal. Not sure. The idea would be then that the different parts of the soul just have different jobs, and one requires a body and the other one doesn't, like requires the body to be in a particular state or something like that, and the other one doesn't. It's a very tame interpretation of Aristotle. Obviously it has some controversy with the text. Other commentators think that the difference between the passive nous and the active nous is the difference between the mind of a mortal being and the mind of a divine being. So those commentators think that in chapter 5, Aristotle is talking about the mind of the prime mover, which is why that part of the soul is eternal, that part of the soul. So if you think about like the activity of the prime mover, the prime mover is just sort of contemplating. It's not doing anything, but it's sort of always active. It's always moving in a sense. By not moving, how can that be? Well, it must be that it doesn't have a body that is thinking. It has like this sort of immaterial thing, the activity of thinking, which is sort of part of its rational soul or something. And maybe that's what Aristotle is talking about in chapter 5. We still need an explanation of how we can have that unembodied soul, though, because again, hylomorphism, it seemed like in order to have a substance, you needed both. But maybe that's what explains also the accounts. There's two types of substances. There's substance as form and substance as compound, right? Maybe. And another available interpretation is just, yeah, I mean, Aristotle was Plato's student, and he still has aspects of Plato's theory. Maybe he's just a Neoplatonist. Maybe this is just Aristotle being like, yep, the understanding just works like sort of how Plato said. I'm more or less agreeing with him. I have other disagreements about how to describe the natural world, but not one about how to describe the soul. And maybe that means that Aristotle does think that the soul is immortal, like that part of the soul is immortal, and the human beings have an immortal soul. And I mean, that was very convenient, that interpretation, for a lot of Islamic and medieval Christian thinkers. But obviously it runs into other issues with the text, particularly in book 1, where he boldly says that, you know, being enmattered is important to our understanding of soul. But however we resolve issues of interpretation, there are other passages that genuinely need explanation. The idea that understanding is alone immortal and eternal, and that we just don't remember that it's immortal and eternal. And it's unclear what he means by don't remember. Is this like a reference to Plato's Meno? Is there some other sense of remember that's relevant here? And he says, the part that understands the forms in the appearances. This sounds very Platonic again. So it's sort of like you see all these particular objects, and you understand the forms by using the appearances that are in front of you, and you sort of pull yourself up, like in the way of Plato's line. And he also finally says the understanding can move to pursue or to avoid, I assume, because it can be attracted by topics or repulsed by topics or something. So the understanding has a motion that's particular to itself. Just a lot of confusing passages, a lot of interpretation to be done. And then the last part of book 3 that is in your text is a passage talking about desire and Aristotle's theory of desire. And this is maybe important both in the context of the discussion of the prime mover and in the discussion of our understanding of animals, and also in our understanding of morality, as we'll see when we talk about the Nicomachean Ethics next week. Desire is an important motivating feature of our day-to-day life and our psychology, and it might be necessary to explain some of the tendencies that we have. And its relationship to imagination is sort of still up in the air. Desire or understanding are the things, according to Aristotle, that can cause movement. So my belief can cause movement, and my understanding, my desire can cause movement, right? So I might believe that there's soda in the fridge, and maybe I'm thirsty, so I will go to the fridge and drink some soda. And that's belief that helps cause movement, but also desire, right? Maybe I want a soda, and that's why I go looking for it. It just so happens that I find it, and so then I drink it. Desiring is necessary for movement, but this in turn requires imagination, Aristotle says in this passage, which is sort of surprising, right? Because remember, animals have movement, but it's not clear that all animals have an imagination. So does that mean that any animals that have movement have imagination? Interesting. Some people would deny that now, but I'm very fascinated by that theory. He also says, perceptual imagination belongs to other animals, but the deliberative imagination or understanding exists only in the rational animals. So the deliberative imagination here is the imagination that tries to make decisions, right, and projects forward about potential circumstances I could find myself in. Whereas perceptual imagination might just be like general figuring out how to move through a room or something. So that sort of helps us with the previous thing, right? Maybe desire is necessary for movement, and maybe in order to have desire, you need perceptual imagination, but not necessarily deliberative imagination. And then we have a question about what's the difference between deliberative imagination and understanding? Is there a difference? What would it amount to? This is like more questions arise. And desire finally doesn't have the deliberative capacity. So desire is not the thing that has the capacity to deliberate already imbued within it. That comes from a different faculty or something like that, a different capacity. So that's it. We've gotten to the end of our analysis of Aristotle's On the Soul. Naturally, a lot of questions still open. I didn't talk about any passages in significant detail, and so you might have been struggling with, I don't know, a particular sentence or two. We all know how challenging Aristotle is. So thanks for sticking this out. I look forward to seeing you in discussion, and take care, everybody. Have a lovely afternoon.